Dateline Geneva for what's been billed as make or break talks. What would it take for Donald Trump to call off airstrikes against an Iran that's told Omani mediators it sees a pathway to compromise over its nuclear program? We'll delve into where the veteran Tehran team of negotiators can entice U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, whose red lines sometimes include the Islamic Republic's missile program, sometimes less so. Neither side's drawing much attention to the actual situation inside of Iran, where after the thousands killed in New Year's protests, fresh dissent erupted as Amnesty International warns of looming executions of tortured demonstrators, some as young as 17. Watching from the sidelines, the likes of France, Germany, the UK, and other signatories of the 2015 UN agreement that Donald Trump ripped up 3 years later. Where to put the accent? And still that question, what is this showdown ultimately about? Today in the France 24 debate, can Iran sway Trump and avoid those US strikes? With us from London, Nega Anga, visiting fellow at King's College London, former senior advisor at the US State Department and National Security Council in the Biden administration. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
From Washington, Behnam Bentaleblu, Senior Director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy think tank's Iran program. Good to see you.
Great to be with you again. Thank you.
Armin Arefi is Senior Correspondent, French news magazine Le Point. Your latest book in French, A Spring in Tehran. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks as well to Kian Habibian, co-founder of We Are Iranian Students. How are you?
Good. What about you?
I'm okay. Your reminder, by the way, you can listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, after a morning session at the Omani ambassador's residence, it's been back to the bargaining table in Geneva. Oman's foreign minister, Badr Abu Saidi, saying after the morning session, praising both sides for, quote, unprecedented openness to new and creative ideas and solutions. Nega Anga, when we spoke earlier with our Tehran correspondent, there was this feeling of anxiety. It's the kind of vague language you put out in Diplo speak when there is no deal. Your thoughts?
Look, I think right now it's premature to judge. I know they're going to come back to the table after speaking with their capitals. But, what we're looking at is, potentially three different diplomatic outcomes. One is going to be an outline agreement, principles agreed to, details to follow kind of thing. The second is a detailed technical accord, maybe precise limits, inspections, sequencing spelled out. And a third option is a premature declaration of success without really much clarity. And right now, I think we're somewhere between the first and the third, but not the second, where there's more of a technical accord. And of course, if these talks end with that familiar language of constructive progress, consultations, without a political decision to bridge those really major divides between both parties, the risk isn't going to disappear. It's just going to compound more and more. And so ambiguity here is combustible. So I think we're going to, depending on what comes out this evening, we can see a slippery slope towards some sort of kinetic action.
Yeah, because what are they negotiating? Are they negotiating solely about the nuclear program? Are they also negotiating about missiles? What's it about?
I think, that is the sobering point is you have sort of the Iran side essentially reporting that they will not talk about missile issues. It needs to be entirely dropped from negotiations. They won't talk about the proxies. But at the same time, they're also signaling in terms of the nuclear file that they will not accept any permanent constraints on its nuclear program. And that's fundamental because from Washington's perspective, it's reluctant to offer any significant upfront sanctions without a discussion on the nuclear file and sort of the end of the entire nuclear file. So what they actually agree on, if Iran refuses permanent limits and the U.S. refuses enrichment and sanctions relief is phased to almost a minimal area, I think the overlapping space in this dialogue is very small. I think one of the things that we are seeing is that both sides are stalling because some of the red lines are incompatible. So without really much of a meaningful political decision on one side or the other, I think you're not going to find some calm in this crisis. It's just going to continue to intensify because of this major gap between both parties.
All right, so plenty of blurred lines in the negotiations and plenty of bluster. Reasons for the Middle East's biggest U.S. military buildup in nearly 3 decades have varied over past weeks in Washington. Here's the President of the United States during his State of the Union address on Tuesday evening.
They've already developed missiles that can threaten Europe and our bases overseas, and they're working to build missiles that will soon reach the United States of America. After Midnight Hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue, starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again, and are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon.
We'll get back to that last point, but first, Behnam Ben Taleblu, this talk of missiles that can strike the United States, for many of our viewers who don't follow this very closely, that sounded like something new. Is this a plausible threat, or is this like in 2003, the claims of weapons of mass destruction of Saddam Hussein that didn't pan out?
Well, no, this is actually quite different. And as the president mentioned there, before the United States is Europe. And you don't need to take it from me. You could take it actually from the E3. As of 2019, while America had left the JCPOA 1 year earlier in 2018, in 2019, the E3, while they still were within the confines of the JCPOA, that's the 2015 nuclear deal, they were also ringing the alarm bell about Iranian advancements in its ballistic missile program, and particular advancements with respect to the payload, range, and weight of certain systems that would put continental Europe well within range. As many of your viewers may know, Iran has a self-declared cap. It's a political cap rather than a technical cap on its ballistic missiles to go up to 2,000 kilometers. But some of those missiles that the Europeans were worrying about, in particular a variant of the North Korean system that Iran received in 2005, can go up to 3,000 kilometers if the payload, weight, and the ranges are adjusted.
But missiles that can hit America?
Missiles that can hit America, at present, they do not have any, but they have multiple, I want to stress multiple, solid propellant and liquid propellant satellite launch vehicles that for over a decade, the U.S. intelligence community has been ringing the alarm bell on that could be used as the body for a potential intercontinental ballistic missile. These technologies are virtually identical, with only 2 main differences. One, that you don't need a reentry vehicle for a satellite, but you certainly do for an intercontinental ballistic missile. And you fire them at a very different trajectory, meaning the body of the projectile goes in a very different direction. But otherwise, and I want to stress this, the DIA, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, last year actually just put out an infographic that is very interesting that assumed that the Islamic Republic in a decade's time, by year 2030, would have more ICBMs potentially capable of targeting the U.S. homeland than North Korea.
Armin Arefi?
Currently, North Korea has at least 20 or 30. Currently, Iran has 0. So just by relative.
Armin Arefi, is it a hypothetical or a real threat?
I think one has to recall that Iran is under embargo, like for 47 years after the hostages taken in the U.S. Embassy in 1980. And that today, especially after the 7th of October and the fact that the Iranian proxies have been downgraded, there is the only deterrence is about its ballistic missiles. And today, what we know about this program of 2,000 missiles they have is that they cannot go up to 2,000 or at least 3,000 meters, which means Israel, which means also to go to, that can reach in Greece, maybe Romania, but not the United States. So I guess what President Trump said is just fake news. And that's something we know, because if they would like to do that, the Iranians, the capacity they don't have, they would have to control the intercontinental ballistic technology, which they don't. So that's not a reality. Today, we all have the information that, especially after the 12 days war, Iran has been rebuilding its ballistic program, about 2/3 of it, of these 2,000 missiles. But we are not, from my point of view, to the extent that President Trump is talking about. It's not about like the 8,000 kilometers that can reach the United States. It's totally nonsense. So on that purpose, yes, it is a big lie. But on the other hand, it is true that Iran has been rebuilding its ballistic missiles program because on their side, on their point of view, that's the only deterrence they have in case of invasion, of foreign invasion that is really on the table today.
All right, and we heard from Iran's president on that second point of Donald Trump's, the one that he hasn't heard Iran say. It renounces nuclear weapons. He insists that the Islamic Republic has Masoud Pezeshkian on Iranian state television.
The Americans might think I'm like a politician in the U.S. who tells lies. But the religious leader of a society can't lie. When he announces that we won't have a nuclear weapon, it means we won't. Even if I want to do that, I can't because of my beliefs. I'm not allowed to do so. But then they claim Iran hasn't said it's not after a nuclear weapon.
Kian Habibian?
Well, it was quite ironic for me to see Pezeshkian saying, I can't lie. I mean, the whole system of the Islamic Republic of Iran is based on lies. He's part of the system who lied about the people who were killed on January 8 and 9. They said that they were terrorists, but we know we have received pictures, hundreds, even thousands of pictures of very young people who were dreaming for a better future. So coming from the words, from the mouth of a murderous state, I would highly doubt their declarations. They have shown throughout their history that they cannot maintain any deal. They don't even have an intention of maintaining any deal. So therefore, we can take for granted any declaration of Pezeshkian regarding their programs, whether they are nuclear or not. The Islamic Republic of Iran represents a threat in the region, and not only in the region. We know that they've been implicated in terrorist attacks in Argentina, in Europe, in Brussels, and therefore it is very ironic to me to hear these words from Pezeshkian. He was also the same guy who 2 years ago who was saying that he's going to make some changes inside of the country. He's going to listen to the people. Now, my question is, how do you listen to the people when you use war-grade weapons against your own civilians?
Nega Anga, let me ask you, when it comes to the nuclear part of this negotiation, is there a way to make it work, to make it stick?
Again, I think, nuance here matters. I think we're in a little bit of a game of chicken. And so there's quite a bit of rhetoric that is going back and forth. I think, what we need to sort of better understand, and I think this is where my deep concern is what is the actual end state that the Trump administration is seeking? I'm not quite sure if the objective is zero enrichment, no missiles, no proxies, behavioral reform inside Iran, so we can better understand, because at that point in time, we're not then negotiating a narrow nuclear deal. We're negotiating regime transformation. Whether Iran is going to sign that or not, we already know that the supreme leader is in survival mode. So I think everyone is seeking potentially an off-ramp, if that's possible. But what the Trump administration is seeking is a little unclear.
All right, you talk about off-ramps. On Wednesday, we got an announcement out of Beirut, a Hezbollah official stating that the Iran-backed movement would consider any attack against Ayatollah Khamenei as a red line, but would not intervene in the event of limited U.S. strikes on Iran. This came out on Wednesday, Armin Arifi. Have they already agreed upon some kind of performative action that all sides already know about? It's a surprising statement, no?
Quite surprising, knowing that Hezbollah hasn't reacted to the 12-day wars and the fact that there have been bombings by Israelis and the Americans, so that showed their actual weakness. What is interesting with what they say is that it could show that some circles in Iran would agree to a limited, show-off strikes to have the two sides saving their face, because we are now in a deadlock, and we know it's Trump says that he wants a deal. The Iranians say he wants a deal. Trump says that he doesn't. He could strike Iran, but we all know that he doesn't want to be engaged in a long war that's against his own political base in the United States. And on the other hand, the Islamic Republic know that they can't. They could strike back in the region, but the army, the military weapons are not the same that what the U.S. has. So it's there is. I could say that no side wants a real war and want to be engaged in a real war without knowing what would be the outcome. So the key would be for both sides to save their face, and that could be either through a deal, even though both positions today are quite far from each other, or limited strikes. But one thing has to be sure, without boots on the ground, without US soldiers on the ground, it's impossible to overthrow the regime. It's a reality on the ground, which is quite different from what was the American purpose in Iraq about 23 years ago.
Yeah, 23 years ago, where we saw those before that, dating back to 1991, we'd had those failed negotiations in Geneva between the then Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz and James Baker.
But the difference at that time was that George W. Bush was totally engaged in the project of overthrowing the Iraqi regime. That's not the case today. Trump has repeatedly said it today, and that's the issue. The Iranians know that, and they are playing on it.
Iranian state television multiplying warnings regarding all the targets around the region that would be game in case of a U.S. attack. And again, broadcasting images, as they've done a lot in recent weeks, of military drills carried out by the Revolutionary Guards. This in the face of that U.S. buildup that includes, again, 2 aircraft carriers, one that's now getting closer to Israel, the other that's in the Arabian Sea, 16 warships in total, 40,000 troops at the ready. Behnam Ben Taleblu, both sides would like an off-ramp if they don't know what's going to happen next, but has the United States kind of talked itself into a corner? I read one statement this week that said that if they don't strike at this point, it's like Barack Obama's red lines on Syria, perhaps even worse, because there's just so many forces that are in play right now.
Well, I don't believe, it's a great question, but I don't believe it's the amassing of forces that has boxed the president in. The president can actually use that for enhanced military containment. His policy prior to the 12-day war, as well as after the 12-day war, was maximum pressure. That's an economic containment and an economic rollback strategy. He could marry that with a tighter military presence in the region. Lest we forget, under President Obama, 2010 to 13, there was not one but 2 U.S. carriers inside the Persian Gulf, and also briefly 2014 to 15, 2 U.S. carriers inside the Persian Gulf. So some of this stuff is not unprecedented. The scale of the logistical hardware is unprecedented, and that's what's bringing us back to 2003. But if we're talking about lock-in or box-in, it's the president's rhetoric, in my view, that may have brought us to that point, particularly from the month of January, because the forcing function for the current standoff, wherever you are on a deal or a war or on missile restrictions or missile termination, it is actually the protests in Iran. Unless we forget, during the 3.5 weeks where there was a 20-plus day internet outage, anywhere from 36 to 43,000 were killed during that, which marks the most violently repressed protest, not just in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic and in that record period of time, but in contemporary Iranian history, so in at least the past 200 years. And it was against that backdrop that President Trump, not once, not twice, but depending on how you count, 8 or 9 times in January, promised help to Iranian protesters, encouraged them. He didn't instigate them. Iranians had well enough grievances and were out there before he even started speaking. But then he actually promised them something that no U.S. president promised in, again, 47-year U.S. Islamic Republic history, which is that help is on its way. And that's why even if you get the best nuclear deal, there is no nuclear off-ramp. There is no diplomatic off-ramp to the crisis of confidence and the crisis of credibility created by those worlds. And worse, stoking the expectations and anticipations of really one of the most pro-American and pro-Israeli peoples in the Middle East, the Iranian people, which is ruled over, as you know, one of the most, if not directly, the most anti-American and the most anti-Israeli governments in the region. So fundamentally, these things are like oil and water right now.
All right, and we've talked a lot about sticks in this show, but there's also carrots that the Iranians are trying to bring to the table. The Financial Times this Thursday headlining, Iran tempts Trump with a bonanza for U.S. companies in bid to avoid war. That front page story quotes a deputy foreign minister who told Iranian businessmen this month that common interests in the fields of oil and gas, including joint fields with neighboring countries, have been included in the talks, purchases of civilian aircraft with the U.S. There are those joint fields. We're talking about, there's plenty of them in the Persian Gulf, including the world's largest natural gas fields, South Pars and North Dome, split between Iran and Qatar. This Thursday, in Geneva, you have Steve Witkoff in the company of Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, seen here with the pair of them seen here with the Omani foreign minister. Jared Kushner, who's got a very personal stake in this, perhaps, I don't know if it's a personal stake in peace, perhaps, because critics point to his Affinity Partners investment firm, which has benefited from capital not only from Saudi Arabia, but also from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Again, we talked earlier about blurred lines. Nega Anga, can Jared Kushner be negotiating on Iran, the Iranians offering business deals, and the negotiator on the U.S. side who happens to do business with the Gulf states?
I can't speak to the ins and outs of what's actually happening in the negotiating room. You know, the devil will be in the details once we hear more readouts of what's actually being negotiated, how it's being negotiated, and the reactions coming out of regional partners. But I would say, I think when we look at the U.S. delegation, though, it is important to note that it's not only Steve Witkoff, but it's also Jared Kushner, which means that this is a priority for the administration, that they are presenting a strong force, that they are actually serious about negotiating.
Does Jared Kushner have
negotiating a good deal or an off-ramp?
Does Jared Kushner have a personal stake in this? He's supposed to be representing a country, right?
He is definitely representing the United States government in his capacity, sitting at the table. But I can't speak to whether he will profit from this deal or not. I think it's too soon to tell.
Armin Arefi?
I was speaking recently with an economist in Iran, Said Leilas, which is close to the reformist camp and which is part of the system. He was saying that according to him, Iran today is the last non-US allied country which is an oil producer, so escaping to the US. So that's interesting. Of course, there might be some possibilities, and the Islamic Republic officials know it, to put on the table these kind of carrots, oil carrots, especially to this U.S. businessman team that is much more specialized in business than on the nuclear issue. But on the other hand, you have, of course, hawks in the U.S., Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel Prime Minister, that is putting pressure to have a strong deal on the technical issues, which means ballistic and nuclear. But of course, we have information, we received information saying that the EU has, Iran, with the approval of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, are okay with the possibility of bringing the US back in the Iranian economy, something Trump has also talked about in the past, saying that he could be the one and only US president to just not only takes out U.S. secondary sanctions, but also U.S. primary sanctions. So, of course, there could be a deal on that. But, of course, on the other hand, you have this nuclear and ballistic missile that is still a huge, huge problem between the two countries.
Behnam Bentaleblu, we saw with Venezuela, in the end, the head of the regime was ousted, but the regime is still there, and they're doing deals, particularly on this talk of when it comes to oil. When it comes to Iran, can it end in a business transaction? Can that sway Donald Trump?
Well, the funny thing about the negotiations right now is that usually the Iranians in the past 2 decades, whether direct or indirect, or with the P5+1 or with the United States, it's been the Islamic Republic seeking the economic guarantees. The funny thing about these negotiations is that the Islamic Republic seems to be the one offering the economic guarantees. So it's quite the switch here. And it gets at really the heart of why the regime is engaging, which is this is not about sanctions relief. This is about trying to survive after it can engage in the worst crackdown in recorded Iranian history, in contemporary Iranian history. So again, we have to have that constantly operating in the background as to why are we here, what are we doing, and what is the purpose. Now, with respect to the Venezuela analogy, the reason I don't see it is because the countries are so different. Yes, they are 2 major oil exporters. Yes, are 2, at least with Venezuela now it's changing, but they are 2 anti-American, oil-rich authoritarian regimes. Now, that's where the similarities end and the differences begin. Both Iranian military capabilities, as well as state structure, as well as society, make it drastically different with Venezuela and therefore prevent the Trump administration from being able to successfully accomplish a decapitation operation that pushes away part of the establishment and brings forward someone else to get these kind of deals. I mean, even in the State of the Union, I forget the exact number, but President Trump referenced the amount of oil since the operation against Maduro that the U.S. had imported. I think there is no such rotation or musical chairs to be had with the government of the Islamic Republic. It has much more significant military capabilities and actually has used them against U.S. forces. We may forget this. It might have been called symbolic. It might have been called limited. It might have been called performative. But the biggest ever ballistic missile barrage against U.S. forces in recorded history was in January 2020 when the Iranians responded to the killing of Soleimani. The state is very, very different. Khamenei, despite being supreme leader, runs a state that is actually not a pyramid. It's a series of parallel institutions. He's institutionalized his power as the country's longest serving autocrat in the contemporary period. So it means it's not going to be a one and done. And then third, of course, is society. Even if the Trump administration is able to manage or push around some kind of elite fracture and get a rotation at the top, potentially do a deal with someone else, society is not going to really handle that because society, again, has been turning out not to protest against one faction, but against the government of the Islamic Republic in its entirety since December 2017. And that would mean President Trump would not get peace, prosperity, and stability, as he stated is his goal in the national security strategy, which came out in December 2017 for the Middle East. So for all those reasons, even if the administration wants it, and I have no doubt the president likes short, sharp, and decisive operations, the facts of the case are going to make that hard, if not impossible, to get.
All right, as negotiators size up carrots, sticks, Amnesty International sounding the alarm over the 30 Iranians, some as young as 17, who've had confessions beaten out of them and now face execution inside of Iran. The 17-year-olds face capital charges, even though international law prohibits the death penalty for minors. In one instance, for the torching of a mosque that killed 2 Basiji militiamen. A source tells Amnesty they were arrested before the fire. Inside Iran, as we've been discussing with our panel, there's been a flare-up of protests in recent days. Our partner station, France 2, spoke to 2 activists. It's a report read by Simon Moritz.
A tense standoff at a university in Tehran. On the right, students who are demanding change. On the other side, waving flags, are supporters of Ayatollah Khamenei. After insults, the groups fought. Similar clashes broke out on several campuses in the Iranian capital. Though the protests had died down, they started up again since universities reopened last Saturday. This clip, filmed by a student, shows protesters burning a flag of the Islamic Republic, a red line for authorities. To do so is to risk grave punishment. Nevertheless, they defied the rule, throwing tattered pieces of the flag at pro-regime supporters. And in an interview at her home, the student said that she was already protesting in January. And she didn't hesitate to rejoin the movement despite the risks.
When I burn the flag of the Islamic Republic, it brings me immense joy, both physically and mentally. The same goes for when I shout "Death to dictators" to express all my anger at everything that we're enduring.
According to France 2, there have been 9 demonstrations at universities in Tehran, and 6 more in cities around the country. The mood is tense after January's crackdown on protesters, which, depending on the source, left between 7,000 and more than 30,000 dead. Meanwhile, the threat of U.S. military intervention looms in the background. For this student protester, it's the very solution.
American military intervention is absolutely necessary. It would be cooperation between the American army and the Iranian people to overthrow this regime.
The CIA posted this message in Persian on its X account Wednesday to make contact with informants in the country. A move that could prove useful in both diplomacy and war.
So Ken Habibian, that activist there saying that it would be great if the U.S. works in tandem with the militants to overthrow the regime. We didn't get much talk of regime change in Donald Trump's State of the Union address. It doesn't seem to be at all what's on the table in Geneva. Your thoughts on the protests that have rekindled now, and have you heard from people in the last couple of days there?
Well, about the protests, first of all, what we can say is the courage of the Iranian population. I mean, they just witnessed the worst massacre of their recent history. At least 36,000 people were killed, and once again, the students are back. And that shows us 2 things. First of all, the Iranians did not wait the US, Israel, or any other country to decide for their own fate. They have tremendous courage, and it did not start on December. It has been the case for the past 47 years. Generation by generation, the Iranian people have fought the Islamic Republic. So first of all, that's the point I wanted to stress. Regarding the potential American intervention, given the descriptions that were given, let's say that it's only via aircrafts. Well, we know that it's not going to guarantee what comes next. And what we need to do is to ensure the things that will allow the regime change. Because just like you said, the topic is completely off the table, and so are the civilians in this discussion. Therefore, we didn't talk about the European Union or other allies in these discussions who have been watching from the sideline. What I think is that these countries should also activate their levers, and it should be around 3 points. The first one is act the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not legitimate anymore, and therefore cut all diplomatic processes that are still going on.
Ken, I'm going to give you bad news. The talks have just wrapped up for the day. We're getting word from the French news agency AFP they're going to meet next week for technical discussions in Vienna. That doesn't sound like Washington's looking to delegitimize for now its interlocutors.
Yeah, so therefore that's why the other countries should activate their own levers, because just like I said, the Iranians are not going to wait eternally for other countries to intervene. I mean, they, with tremendous courage, took to the streets once again. So therefore, we need to push for other things. The first one, like I said, is for the EU and other countries such as Canada or the UK to act the lack of legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. The second one is using their military dissuasion to put pressure to ask for the release of political prisoners, to stop the executions that have been going on despite what Donald Trump said. And the third one, and I think that's one of the most important points, is to engage a dialogue with the opposition. No one even tried to engage a dialogue, to engage this process of transition in a democratic and secular framework.
We saw Armin Arefi back in June when there were those 12 days of strikes on Iran, that, again, the opposition coming out of the women life freedom protests, very upset with the regime. But there was this kind of moment where people did feel a sense of nationalism, that they don't like their country being bombed from abroad.
Who likes his country being bombed from abroad? That's the real question.
So what would U.S. strikes do in terms of public opinion and the activists that Kian is talking about?
If we go back to the 12-day wars, I could tell you that, of course, these people in Iran were not in the streets because they were escaping bombs. That's why, like, all those who could, despite what Benjamin Netanyahu was asking them to go in the streets, escaped to the north of the country, especially people in Tehran and other places. If we look at the situation now, after this huge massacre, historic massacre that Kian Nabibian talked about, people are still in a shock and a state of totally loneliness in Iran. That's what they're feeling. And some of the demonstrators that I'm talking to are so desperate that they are asking for someone to help them. And like Behnam Ben Taleblu said, for the first time in 47 years of the Islamic Republic of Iran, there is a US president that is at least publicly saying that he's going to help the Iranian people. The problem is that, like, for 1 month, he has done anything. He has not done anything. He was saying that help was coming. It has not come. He said that he avoided 800 people execution. That was never on the table, even though now today there are 30 people that are on the death row. What I mean is that there are some people in Iran that hope that something could come from outside to go and continue their protest. That's a possibility. Some in Washington or in Jerusalem are betting on that. Maybe not Donald Trump, but some hawks. On the other hand, we have to be clear that for the moment, even though I agree with what Kian says about Iranian people, we have to know that the regime has been able until now to totally crush the dissent by killing its own people with weapon-grade weapons. So as if they were terrorists. And on the other hand, that today there are no military rebellion position on the ground. So without the willingness of Donald Trump to send U.S. forces, the regime knows that for the short period, for the short time, for the short moment, he would be on the field, that he is stable. He doesn't risk to be overthrown from one day to another. So the question is, what is today the goal of Donald Trump with these negotiations? It's a nuclear deal, he's saying, maybe a deal about ballistic missile. The problem is that he's until now asking for a capitulation to the Iranians. That's what the regime is not ready to accept. On the other hand, if he strikes Iran, if it's limited, it could be like a show-off to be able to save face. But if it's more serious strikes, maybe on the regime, the headquarters of the IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, or the Basiji, or even the heads of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, then maybe it could change the situation, because Ayatollah Khamenei, as we know, is the key of the regime. It is the head, the real president. And if he's targeted, as the Israelis tried or wanted to do in late June, it might change the situation, knowing that there are some people within the security apparatus of Iran that, of course, saw the massacres and that might be much eager to negotiate a real deal with the U.S.
Nega Anga, would strikes win hearts and mind?
Look, I think in some ways limited strikes for many feel emotionally satisfying, but it's obviously strategically dangerous. And so far, and I think this is where a lot of the National Security Council meetings advising the president is that there is no evidence that a limited first strike would produce concessions, right? If Tehran believes it will not capitulate and believes escalation is coming, it has every incentive to impose costs early. And because of that, there are concerns about how to strategically manage this, whether it's Iran targeting U.S. bases and facilities in the region, whether it's closing the Strait of Hormuz and having an impact more on the markets. The markets are already on the fritz right now, and the reality that this could turn into a campaign and not necessarily a one and done effort. And the president obviously is quite concerned about reputational stakes at this point in time, because as the previous speaker is mentioning, where the supreme leader's worldview right now is, it's centered on resistance. It's on survival driven mode, whether it's killing its own citizens in the starkest way possible, but also looking at succession and regime durability. And so some of the concerns, and I know this has been repeated quite a bit, but if any external strikes occur, I think the reality that everyone's concerned about is the rally around the flag dynamics by the security apparatus. We haven't seen that many defections occur. And the key variable in this scenario is whether any security forces remain cohesive or if they defect. And they are essentially what sustains the regime at this moment in time.
So, Ben Taleblu, the fact that negotiations have adjourned in Geneva will graduate to Vienna, which is home to the International Atomic Energy Agency, is that a sign that for now the guns will remain silent?
It's still too soon to say. I mean, even if we go back to 2025, again, less than a year ago, Washington and Tehran, albeit indirectly, were in between rounds when the firing started. I mean, lest we forget, there was a date the president did give here, I think a few days ago. He said 10 to 15 days. Let's see if he's as legalistic about that timeline in 2026 as he was in 2025 with that hard 2-month deadline. But certainly Vienna is home to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Rafael Grossi had been meeting, that's the Director General of the IA, had been meeting with the Iranians. But there's no real way for Grossi even to pull a rabbit out of a hat, even if we put aside missiles, even if we put aside regional, even if we put aside the atrocious domestic situation inside the country today. There is no way to square the circle on some of the things that even before today were being floated about ways to get around zero enrichment, whether you have a multinational fuel bank and multinational enrichment, well, that just multilateralizes the security problem and distributes fissile material. Whether you delay potential restoration of enrichment, well, that restores the zero sunsets provision that got the Trump administration to leave the JCPOA in 2018. So there's lots of issues politically and technically. And just because the negotiations are being extended does not mean, in my view, anywhere that we are closer to some kind of diplomatic agreements, even though I believe that there is no such thing, again, as a diplomatic off-ramp to the humanitarian crisis.
Now, we heard Kian Habibi on earlier saying to us how he's calling on those European signatories to the 2015 agreement to step up, to get more involved. Iran in the headlines here in France this Thursday. 2 French nationals have been released from prison in Tehran, but remain inside the French embassy and are forbidden from leaving the country. A court in Paris convicting an Iranian national of glorifying terrorism in social posts. Her name is Madieh Esfandiari. She got a 4-year sentence, 3 of which have been suspended for posts praising Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. She's been ordered to leave the country, but she's free on appeal for now. She's lodged an appeal. And this is a small case. The French are accusing a bit of hostage diplomacy on the part of the Iranians with those 2 French nationals. We heard the Iranian foreign minister who told us back in November that we can work out a swap, is what he effectively said. How does this case inform how Iran's going to behave if it's under further attack?
Well, this case was very sensitive for France, and that's a reason why he long hesitated and blocked at the European level the placing of the IRGC on the terrorist European list, because he knew, and we have had hostages for now 3 years, Cécile Colère and Jacques Paris, in Iran. Now they are, as you said, freed, but they are still at the embassy.
So if Madieh Esfandiari goes back to Iran, then we'll hear a more combative France when it comes to that?
That's not what I'm saying, because France has been the country that enabled the IRGC to be placed on the terrorist list, and which angered a lot Iranians. Now you have this appeal, so it's still not clear if Mahdi Esfandiari will leave France or not. She's free, at least until now, to leave. The thing is that if she goes back to Tehran, then it will enable the Iranians to free, or at least to let the two French hostages to be back in France. That's what their families have been calling for years. And that could solve at least a small problem, and even a huge problem between France and Iran. But on the other subjects, such as, I think France did its best, and the most concrete thing it could do was placing the IRGC on the European, or not at least blocking it to be on the list. Now, unfortunately, on the Middle East affairs, on the Iranian affairs, and especially on the military affairs, France is off the table, and that's a reality. We have to accept it. The ball is in the hands of only one person, which is Donald Trump.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Armin Arefi, I want to thank you. I want to thank Kian Habibian, Behnam Bentaleblu for being with us from Washington, Nega Anga in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.